Hey gang, welcome back once again, Module 12. This is a huge topic. And so I said I would kind of continue our discussion of TFCBT into this week. It really goes into working with parents. So this should really, if you're going to work with parents, you're going to have conjoined therapy sessions. Some of the resources here come from our PTSD packet from TFCBT, Trauma Focused Cognitive Behavioral Therapy. Some of this is external, and I'll take you through our content. So let's see what we have. So here's our outline, and our outline looks like this. I have a big game plan. I don't know that we'll get through all of it, but really looking to identify appropriate interventions for parents of children who experience trauma. So parents, and really looking at non-offending versus offending. This is a huge subject. You know, if we're talking about family therapy for children who are, or their parents may have perpetrated, they may have not. We'll talk about some factors that preclude parent involvement in child therapy. We're going to prioritize factors according to safety. So I want you to read Chapter 7 and Appendix 1 in the book, and like I said, from TFCBT, from your Cohen-Monterino book. And then I've got some supplementary materials in the auxiliary folder, and we'll really take a look at those for what we're doing in our discussion. So here's our lecture overview. It's really, I just need to go straight to the auxiliary folder here because this will help you discern what to do. So I have two groups of information. So I've got abuse and power wheels provided to you, an adult domestic violence safety plan. So if you're working with the child and the adult is in a domestically violent relationship, this is for non-offending parents. I've got a program for non-offending parents. I shared the labeled praise handout again. It's good for parents just to get a different dynamic with their kids. But then I've got these are the same thing. These assuring child safety is actually the same thing. And I'll delete one of those in just a second. And also talking about PTSD neurology. This one's really for offending parents and what we can do as therapists. So let's go to non-offending parents first. So the main things that non-offending parents need to do, this comes straight from our work with, at least here in Oklahoma, it comes from OU Health Sciences Center, our work with non-offending parents. And the number one thing, and so there's some information if you're working with non-offending parents to help you. This is actually provided. I was doing a group with non-offending parents for a while, and so that we actually use this as just a baseline curriculum. But if you go into what a child needs from their non-offending parent, the BRAVE acronym is very appropriate. So number one, and I would say this goes straight to how well a child recovers from trauma, how well they do after the traumatic event, is that their parent or their caregiver believes them. The number one thing to do is to believe the child. I cannot tell you the amount of mental anguish, suffering that I've seen from parents who do not believe their child, that something happened to them. And that happens a lot. It happens a lot more than you'd like to think. The initial gut reaction when something bad happens, especially, if it's concerning another loved one or another close person, is it didn't happen. The child had to have made that up. That person couldn't have done that to them. It's this natural defensiveness, this natural, refusal to accept what's actually happening. But that's so important. Comforting, reaching out and comforting. I'm here for you. Assuring the child, no matter what happens, I'm going to be here for you. Validate, it's okay. Children feel this way. It's okay to feel this way. Your feelings are okay. And encouraging your child to talk. So again, this acronym, very important. All those aspects. Number one, and they all follow after if an adult actually believes the child. Sometimes hearing the abuse can be too much for the parent. Sometimes the parent or the caregiver has their own abuse history. And so it's important, or trauma history. So it's important that you provide the caregivers with resources to help as they're supporting the child. And that's been really common. We worked at an agency. I directed an agency before this, and so I would really make sure that parents were supported with their own therapist as the child was going through, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy or just, trauma-related therapy. So those are really important aspects. You're welcome to work through this. Again, it's in a workbook fashion. It can be used, for you to formulate ideas of what to do when you're actually out in the field. So the second thing that I'd like to talk about is what to do when children are required to work with an offender. Let me see if I can get this. First of all, I want to note this concept, and I was able to find this. The bias of the brain is to never forget things, and new learning is much more fragile. We don't experience new learning with as much power as the primitive systems get activated with fear. So if you remember, we talked about neurons that got wired together, fire together, especially in traumatic instances. We have all these emotions, all these things tied in through our amygdala, going through making these memories very, very vivid, very, very evocative. It's important. So, like, for instance, if somebody was sexually abused by, a close person to them, often sexuality gets wired with shame. So when shame comes up, sexuality follows, or vice versa. Or perhaps it was somebody who really loved them, and they abused them. And then you have this really complicated wiring of love being associated with abuse. I put that in there. Sometimes too close of a therapist and client bond can be counterproductive. I think that you would have some humanists that would argue with that, but there is some research out there that says having some distance in that professional relationship can help them work out and sort through confused and often convoluted wirings. Going back into PTSD neurology. No, that's not it. Sorry. Going back into assuring child safety. The reason I shared that along with assuring child safety is sometimes and I will say sometimes, many times systems fail children. In other words, there may not be enough evidence to convict someone, and a parent somehow retains their rights, wants to have visitations. Even though child welfare may be going through an investigation, may have confirmed abuse, there wasn't enough to prosecute. There's not enough to withstand in a court. And so this comes from someone else's work. I would say this is one of the top 3. I've been to hundreds of trainings through my career. This was one of the top 3 most important. And I wished I'd had it when I began. So that's why I'm sharing it with you. This comes from Sue Ann Kinney Noziska, and she's a social worker and a registered play therapist and a supervisor. And I really wished and so I give her complete credit for this. I'm not trying to claim any of this for my own. You can see it's copyrighted. It was back in 2012. I went to a huge conference in Dallas, the Crimes Against Children conference. About 5,000 people that attended. And I really was fortunate to attend a couple of her trainings. And she helped me conceptualize differently how to work with systems that aren't acknowledging the child's perspective. Like, you have caseworkers, well, we need to work toward reunification. Well, you have a child that's not safe. You have an offender that hasn't worked through their own stuff. You have, how do you deal with this as a therapist? Sometimes we're put in really tough predicaments. And so what I learned through this is that it's up to us to be the voice of the child. It's up to us to speak for their emotional and psychological well-being. And so this goes through some very clear parameters. I'm gonna take some time because this is very important. If you're working with children and you're working in cases where they might reunify with an offender, I can't stress enough how important this is, because it does give you some clear guidelines. And again, I'm giving you, and she gave a really good resource list at the end here too, to go back and look at some resources that can help you and substantiate. If you're in a court and they're trying to say, well, why don't you think the offender needs to have, we don't have any charges. Why can't this person see their child? Well, because their child's having a traumatic reaction. And psychologically contraindicated. So here's what I'm going to say. Not all cases are appropriate for contact and or reunification. Here's what I like. The victim must desire contact. Now, I will say this. There's oftentimes a fantastic kind of thinking that happens with kids where they envision that they're going to get back together with the offender and things are going to get better and they're not going to get hurt again. So you have to caution against that too. Parents and guardians must be involved and supportive. So they have to be supportive of the child's therapy. Any form of contact must be a victim-driven decision. So in other words, at some point, their will has been taken out of their control. They have to be in control to feel safe. Victims should be experienced as empowerment by the victim. In other words, they should have the say. It's a fluid process based on therapeutic needs of each individual. So if there's an offender that hasn't gotten treatment, well, you know what? This person hasn't gotten any sort of treatment whatsoever for what's going on with them. They need to go and get treatment themselves. Only be initiated once both victim and offender have made sufficient progress. A lot of times an offender may go to treatment and kind of whitewash and stonewall and gain an ally in their own therapist and maybe not be completely forthcoming about what's happened, wanting that renewed contact. Ongoing contact may be delayed or even stopped pending reassessment. Guidelines are not a substitute for skill and experience. So again, hopefully people get some skill if they're going into this field, and really consult with your supervisors a lot. Sexual abuse is a systemic issue that cannot be treated in isolation. Ensuring safety is of utmost importance. And so, what do they do in domestically violent situations? They typically put the child and the mom or the victim in a shelter, and they leave the offender in charge. That's not what's called for here. The offender needs to go. The child needs to stay in familiar surroundings, ideally. I know that doesn't always happen, but ideally, that's what would happen. Emotional damage of sexual abuse outlasts any physical damage. Interacting with the offender prematurely may create emotional damage and impedes healing. So again, there has to be safety. And if this offender hasn't worked through the issues, that's going to impede healing. A lot of times you'll see families trying to discount or even discourage the child from, this didn't really happen to you. So damaging. A period of no contact is considered vital for the victim to feel protected and emotionally safe. Victim and offender absolutely need separate therapists. Talk about a conflict of interest. Let me keep going here. Do you have a non-offending cooperative parent? Is there an adolescent with illegal sexual behavior going on? No. Do you have reunification? Is there an adult sex offender? So here's how you can tell. I'm going really fast because I know this is, everybody's under a lot of time constraints. This should be its own 3-hour, 6-hour training. But I want you to be aware that there are resources out there. That's honestly what this class is. It's like, here's a wellspring of information. Should you go into the field and you're doing something like this, hopefully I've given you something you can grasp onto and dig deeper and find more. This is really a survey of options course. It's not like an in-depth, it's more of an overview exploration than an in-depth exploration. So victim readiness, the acute symptoms have to be resolved. So if there's self-harm, if there's, concerns, they're not making it in class, they're, any thought of the offender and they decompensate, those are acute symptoms. There has to be desire for contact. So important. Understand that the offender is solely responsible. So a lot of times families, offenders particularly, will put guilt, feelings of responsibility on the victim, and that needs to be worked through in therapy before there's contact. The victim has to be able to communicate needs and concerns, and also has to understand personal boundaries. So if there's not a boundary awareness, there's not an ability to communicate when things aren't going right. That's important. Recognizes concerns with secrecy, no secrets. Feels safe, recognizes warning signs of abuse, and really has developed a personal safety plan. So these things need to be in place before there's contact. As far as the non-offending parent, resolve that denial, as I talked about with the believe in the prior handout. Has to hold the offender responsible. Avoid victim blaming, minimization, justification, externalization. We must ensure victims' well-being. Resolve family structure and patterns that supportive abusive behaviors. Let's change things that led to this. Have to protect and support the victim. Also demonstrate assertiveness, self-sufficiency, and use of external resources. Participate in offenders' relapse prevention plan. Also, they need to work collaboratively with professionals. If the non-offending parent's not supportive, then why should we reunify when there's not a person that's going to be safe outside the therapist office? Comply with again, safety is the big issue in this. Oh boy, and we go into adult sex offenders. They're heterogeneous group. They vary in degree of risk to children. I'm going to have you work through this. If you have questions, reach out on the discussion board. I'll check through there, but they have their own unique needs, but they definitely need treatment. And that's tough. It's not something that I want to do as a professional, but they definitely need to work through. Adolescents with illegal sexual behavior are a different animal. They typically aren't going to be sexual offenders as adults. If you had to create a profile for adolescent with illegal sexual behavior, it's somebody who is socially isolated, kind of socially awkward, maybe doesn't have a lot of friends, maybe developmentally delayed a bit, definitely socially delayed, and not finding an outlet. And so there may be some experimentation with younger peers. And so adolescents with sexual behavior problems may not very well turn out to be adults with sexual behavior problems. It's just something, working through. It depends. That's really the profile of the adolescent sexual offender, is what I just described there. Oh wow, this is just a difficult subject. This gives this gives kind of a cross reference, a matrix to work through. So you know, contact reunification. You know, if the risk of reoffense is low and they've been treated, possibly the risk of repeated, you know, repeated abuse is high, then no, untreated no. So anyway, you're welcome to work through that matrix. Just sad I don't have more time to go into this. A really good resource. Again, I shared it from a person I listened to a few years ago. Um, Domestically violent situations. Let me see if I can find a good video to give you on that, and we'll go from there. Again, I try to keep these short because I know time is of the essence. We're covering 2 modules per week. This one really could go on for quite some time, and there's just a lot of variables to consider. So please look through the discussion questions. Just do your best to respond. Again, I don't expect anybody to be an expert in this area at this point, but you know, by working through, by responding, we can learn. So I look forward to reading what you have to say, and reach out if you have any questions. Take care.